just a quick introduction myself. I'm Times Radio's chief political commentator, which is as pompous a title as you'll ever get anywhere, and also presenter on the station. I present the Sunday morning politics show, our sort of flagship politics show, with Gloria De Piero, who is a former Labour MP, and we call it G&T, and that's 10 a.m. till 1 p.m. And I'll stop plugging after that. I've been down in the Westminster lobby for about 11 years now. I was the Sun's political editor for 10 years until May, when I left for Times Radio. Still very much in the building, and I write for the Times every now and then as well, and the Sunday Times too. So we're all still part of the News UK family. Happy to talk to you about Times Radio later, but I'll probably stop the plugging there. So I'm going to talk to you today about what to expect from 2021, which obviously leads seamlessly on for 2020. And 2021 is all about everything we've seen and all the problems we've had and resolved and not resolved in 2021. So I'll talk for half an hour or so, and then if we then move on to questions and have a thoroughly healthy debate. I've been told to try and provoke you. So I'll do my level best to do that without upsetting you, which is always a very fine balance. But thank you for hearing me out. Thank you especially to Mark Beasley, if he's on the call, who is my own company, News UK's HR director. I hope he really enjoys this talk, since he controls my salary and bonuses, etc. And he'll know how meagre it really is. So 2021, I'm going to come clean immediately and confess I have no idea what's going to happen in 2021. And you might be tempted to turn off instantly from that, because it's really political journalists like me job to project, predict, tell you what's going to happen, tell you what it all means, and tell you where it's all going. And we've all been doing that for years, really, as we've sort of ridden the Brexit roller coaster. At times, it feels like we're riding a roller coaster in the dark, really, over the last sort of 4 or 5 years. Few of us really called any of this, where we got to various events. Clearly, no one called a global pandemic to reduce us to where we are, which is, you know, a social, health, and economic full-blown crisis, the likes of which we've possibly never seen in modern times, but certainly not since wartime anyway. But I think why it's so hard to call 2021 is because we're going into the year with so many unknowns and so many different variables. How is coronavirus going to pair out? How long will it take to get control of the virus? What's going to happen with the Brexit deal? What's the Joe Biden presidency going to look like? There's a lot of different variables now that we just simply don't know the answer to. I don't think we've gone into a political year as the one we're about to go into, 2021, knowing so little about how we could come out of it. It's quite extraordinary when you go through it all. What I am going to do, to stop you all from turning off though, is go through those variables. So I hope in about 28 minutes time to have given you saying the shape of what it could look like, or the brackets anyway. I'll divide it into probably 3 parts. First, the Prime Minister's fortunes, which are intrinsically tied up with COVID. So I'll deal with COVID and the Prime Minister's fortunes as a one-er. Then perhaps we can talk about Brexit, and then a little bit of a Biden administration, what that looks like. So the Prime Minister's fortunes and COVID. He was elected as the Brexit Prime Minister. You all know why. He won a majority of 80 exactly a year ago, minus, 10 days now, December the 13th, when all the votes were counted, which was a extraordinary feat. It made him the most powerful and popular Conservative Prime Minister since the 1980s, since Margaret Thatcher. And to scroll on almost 12 months to where he currently is now is quite incredible. COVID has changed his fortunes entirely. It almost killed him. But his handling of it, pretty much any government's handling of it, has been difficult. His has been especially so. And he now finds himself really commanding a Conservative Party that disrespects him and doesn't obey him any longer. And that majority of 80 is therefore notionally reduced to 0. You saw that in the House of Commons again on Tuesday night, when 55 of his own MPs rebelled against him, a further 15 abstained. So he has a majority of 80, that's 40 go the other way, and suddenly that's all wiped out. So it's almost like he's presiding over a minority government all over again. Let's talk about the virus, where that's going to go, and then I'll come back to where that works out for the Prime Minister. So what do we know so far? Well, we know the Pfizer vaccine has got approved by the MRHA yesterday. You've all heard that news, which is stupendous. It does make us the envy of the world. There's no two ways about that. The Americans are very jealous. Donald Trump is probably going to be busy firing most people in the US FDA, Food and Drug Administration, for not approving the vaccine quicker, and Europeans are carping a little bit about why they didn't, why we've been premature, although obviously we're rejecting that. But it's a huge feat. I think Matt Hancock summed it up very well yesterday. He said it was a day to remember in a year to forget, which is very pithy. And it's just worth looking at someone like Matt Hancock and how he's changed over the year, and how COVID has changed him too. Matt Hancock I've known for a very long time, ever since I went down to the lobby in 2009. Then he wasn't even an MP, he was Boris Johnson's chief of staff. Sorry, he was George Osborne's chief of staff. He was the shadow chancellor, Boy George as he was known as then. And Matt was an extremely bumptious, full of himself Tory aide, just got himself selected for a seat in Suffolk. And at the time he was nicknamed 22nd Matt. And he's called 22nd Matt because he'd talk to you at a drinks party, and then within 20 seconds, sometimes less, he'd be looking over your shoulder to try and work out who else was more interesting in the room, so you could go and dump you and talk to them. But brimming with confidence and arrogance as well, really. At the dispatch box, just before the vote on Tuesday night, just before 7 p.m. on Tuesday night in the House of Commons, he was pretty much in tears as he was telling the story about his step-grandfather, Derek, who died of coronavirus in Liverpool about 2 weeks ago, and was really a broken man, a shell of his former bumptious self, having been driven through hell by demons over the last 8-9 months of trying to manage this pandemic. The better news is the vaccine is obviously here. If you were listening avidly to Times Radio this morning, you might have heard me talk about those 800,000 vaccine doses, which I am told are already on UK soil. They came over overnight from Pfizer's Belgian factory near Antwerp, and they came over in incredible national secrecy. Huge national security operation going on. It was under very heavy guard. I managed to work out that it was in a truck, just one large lorry, because you can fit 800,000 doses of a vaccine into that. They're carrying something called a pizza box, which slightly intrigued me, but 900 doses in each pizza box. I suspect they've been cleaned of pepperoni slices and cheese droppings before they put them into the pizza boxes, and that's just a name. But the doses are already here. What we don't know is how quickly it's going to take to roll those doses out. And that will obviously decide a lot. The problem with that vaccine, of course, is distributing something that needs to be stored at -70 degrees centigrade is not easy at all. But we expect them into hospitals next week, and then the vaccination process to begin. Awful lot of people to get through. 30 million in phase 1, which is the high risk group, basically everybody with a health condition or above the age of 50. And we don't know how long that's going to take. Best case scenario to vaccinate all those 30 million is probably March. Worst case scenario is the summer, possibly late summer, autumn. And it's entirely dependent on a couple of things. First, the speed of production of the vaccine. How quickly can Pfizer pump these things out? We don't know that, and what is the competing demand on them from the entire globe, because other national regulatory agencies will be approving the Pfizer vaccine pretty soon. How quickly will other vaccines get approved? The AstraZeneca one, the Moderna one, who can then start coming online, how quickly can they supply? And then how quickly can you administer these, get them to the places where they need to be administered, hospitals, GP surgeries, care homes, and the like. So already you've got a spread of best case scenario March, worst case scenario summer, of when the pandemic is officially declared an end. That leads us neatly onto the economy and the recovery from coronavirus, which I don't need to tell you too much about. You're obviously painfully aware of what's going on with the economy. It's wholly linked really to how quickly the pandemic can end. Because only when the pandemic ends can people fully get back to work, although I suspect you'll know this better than I do, but we won't get back to work in the same shape or form as we've been in before, and the world that is Zoom and Zoom Faces. Zoom Faces we talked a lot on Times Radio this morning. There is now the perfect demeanour and way to behave on Zoom meetings, and there is the wrong demeanour. And I confess I suspect I get most of it wrong, but it is quite transformative in the way we will work and will continue to be so. But there's also the shape of the public finances. Now they're in a dire strait, £400 billion deficit, as well you know. Now that is manageable and serviceable when interest rates are as low as they are, and they're at sort of historic record low. If interest rates start to creep up, and they would have to creep up if inflation starts kicking in and there is a recovery, inflation starts going up, all the central banks will feel the need to start raising interest rates again. Suddenly servicing that £400 billion deficit and over £2 trillion national debt is a lot harder. And the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, spoke a bit about that in an interview with my colleague John Pinar on Times Radio yesterday. I happen to know as a fact that rising interest rates are the single thing that worries him most and literally keeps him awake at night. He wakes up with cold sweats, literally, at the thought of interest rates rising and suddenly Britain being plunged into a sovereign debt crisis. Now, economists have a furious argument about how likely this is and how it isn't, and whether, if the world is in huge debt, no one's really going to start raising interest rates or demanding extra money for debt anytime soon. But it is definitely a threat. So how quickly can the government return to the country to prosperity, and how quickly can they start solving the mess that the public finances are in? Definite tensions between number 10 and number 11 over that already. You hear rumours, I haven't heard this confirmed, of Rishi Sunak now publicly slagging off the Prime Minister for his spendthrift tendencies. They had a fairly decent dust-up at the beginning of this week over the Prime Minister's last concession to the Tory rebels on more money for pubs, which he thought might help him get his plan over the line for the tiering system. It didn't quite work out that way, not least because the Chancellor only offered something like £40 million, which is about £1,000 each per pub in December. But there are huge tensions growing there, and those will continue as long as the Chancellor attempts fiscal consolidation, aka spending cuts and tax rises to try and get rid of the deficit. But both those questions, how quickly can you solve the hole in the public finances and how quickly can you turn us back to prosperity, I think are entirely dependent on several things, not least what actually happens to the virus. You've heard this alphabet soup of predictions now on what the shape of the recovery is going to be. V-shaped, W-shaped, Nike tick, square root sign, and that got me leaning for my old school books trying to work out what a square sign actually looked like. But it is quite extraordinary, even now, just how varied those predictions are. And I'm going to produce my only slide of the entire presentation right now, courtesy of Rosie, who hopefully put that up on the screen, and there it is. Let me briefly explain what this is. So this, I think, demonstrates the real nub of my entire talk. That there in front of you is a graph produced by the Office for Budget Responsibility last week, when they were doing their biannual forecast on the state of the economy and everything else, as they're mandated to do, and the Chancellor announced that during the spending review. There you can see what perhaps started off as a V-shaped recovery. If you look at the 100 line, 100 means where the economy should be. So you can see going into the pandemic, the start of 2020, we were at 100, which is where growth was. Then obviously we took a spectacular dip as the economy shut down for the first lockdown. And then you can see the half of the V coming back when things are reopened again. Now, what is the fascinating bit is from now onwards, economists, the Office of Budget Responsibility, nobody can predict with any surety at all how quickly we can get back to trend growth. And trend growth here is 100 on this graph. It's where those lines hit 100 again. And you can see vast amounts of arrays of possibilities. Even the OBR didn't dare pick one. They went for a central forecast, which they had to, which is the blue line there, the November forecast. because they're mandated to do that, but they were far comfortable showing the vast spread. The two things that dictate the speed of the recovery, or how quickly we'll get back to where we were when the pandemic struck in February, March, are how quickly the virus has got under control and how quickly the economy can reopen, but also Brexit. And that's what's meant on the notes there by WTO, World Trade Organization scenario. That means Brexit, the transition period ending on January the 1st next year, with no deal in place, and therefore we resort to WTO terms, World Trade Organization trading terms. And you can see that the OBR are particularly cold to WTO, and the worst possible downside is the virus is a long time to control, and we're trading on WTO terms for a while. And you can see there, that's the bottom jagged line, the very bottom of the graph. We don't actually return to growth, the sort of growth and output we had in March, not very long ago, until deep into 2025, which is, as well you know, 4 or 5 years away from where we are. Upside, as in the best possible scenario, is we leave with a decent trade deal in place, more about that in a minute, and the virus is got under control very quickly and the vaccine is rolled out and we all get back to normal. In that scenario, look at the very top line, which is the very light dotted grey, and you can see we get back into where we were, the size of the economy, just before the start of 2022. Perhaps, second, third, possibly fourth quarter 2021. So that, I think, really sums up what I'm trying to tell you in a nutshell. There is a huge spread of outcomes for the forthcoming year. And it really is pretty much anyone's guess how quickly they'll go. Thank you for that slide, Rosie. If we can go back to just my mug, I'll continue where we are. But if you can bear in mind that spread, that's the thing I want to try and sort of persuade you to keep in mind. What's the best bet really for an alphabet number for the shape of the recovery? Well, I think you saw from that graph really, it's not V, W, Nike, or even K, which is some people do well, some people do badly. I think it's going to look pretty much like that graph, which is basically hand-shaped. So if you can see my hand now, look at your own hand if you want. If the economy is here now, it's coming down, going from right to left or left to right, depending how you look at my hand. But there are 5, 10, 20, whatever different outcomes, depending on what sector you're in. I mean, that's reasonably obvious. Financial services, probably towards my thumb up here, because no one's really suffered too much. People are working from home, but hiring will restart again, hopefully quite quickly. Retail, probably in the middle. They've had a terrible hit this year. Hospitality down towards the bottom, because it'll be a year really by the time they'll be able to properly open up, if not longer, and pubs will be going to begin trading again, by which stage I think it's highly likely quite a few will be going out of business. So that is people's best guess in terms of the shape of the recovery. There is one tiny bit of good news, though, I think, just to take away before we finish on the economy. And that's what's known in the trade, or I've just christened the Rupert Harrison theory, which is Rupert Harrison was George Osborne's chief of staff when he was Chancellor, a brilliant guy and a brilliant mind, now runs funds for BlackRock and is a very good economist. And he is convinced that actually, despite all the doom and gloom and despite the hits to the economy, there's a whole load of money stored up in people's pockets already that they haven't spent last year. Businesses, households, and actually a whole load of people are sitting on reasonably healthy bank balances. Of course, not in the hospitality industry, but elsewhere. And that money is just gagging to be spent. So if, when the recovery kicks in, then that money will be spent, and suddenly you'll see a quite spectacular uptake as everyone starts dipping into those capital pools that they've been sitting on. So that's the ray of hope. How does this all fit in with Boris Johnson then, both the end of the virus and the speed of the recovery? And what are his political fortunes? Well, I mean, you see people writing him off already now. My personal take is that he is in a deep hole. There's no two ways about it. Britain is in the unfortunate situation of having the largest amount of deaths and one of the worst economic hits of most countries in the world. If you plot a graph I won't give you another one, but a graph like that, you do deaths up there and economic hit down here, Britain's sort of up there. We managed to do badly on both, and that has caused him deep political pain, rather obviously. One senior Conservative said to me the other day, who was leading a leading figure in his campaign for leadership, that he's deeply disappointed in Boris Johnson. He told me he's making it up as he goes along. To which I said, "This is the first time you've realised this. It's the first time you've caught this about our Prime Minister. A brilliant raconteur and an inspiring person that he is, but it does have a habit of slightly winging it." I think the honest answer is, if Boris Johnson does manage to return prosperity to the country by 2022, 23-ish, and he can start being seen to deliver for those 50 or so red wall seats, those former Labour seats he won off Labour in December, which is going to be where the next election is won or lost. There's no two ways about that. But if he can be seen to delivering there, if the polls are looking good there, the Tories will hang on to him. If he's seen not to be delivering, if he's still seen to be without a plan, it's all going wrong, then they'll get rid of him very quickly. Conservatives are ruthless. We've seen this many times with their leaders. Theresa May, the most recent one, but John Major, John Major walked voluntarily, but they did try to get rid of him. But Margaret Thatcher, they like success and they like power. And when someone is looking like a drag on that, then they get out the door pretty quickly. There's one more, of course, crucial test for Boris Johnson to get through this year, and that is Scotland. Without a doubt, the most existential threat to the United Kingdom is going to be the Holyrood elections, when Nicola Sturgeon will claim, if she wins and wins big, and certainly there's nothing to suggest she won't do that at the moment. She's still about 50% in the polls in Scotland, the SNPR, which is a staggering feat, really, when she's been in government for over 10 years up there. But if she wins big, then she'll use that as a mandate to call a second referendum. And what then does Boris Johnson do? And I have to tell you, talking to people inside Downing Street and the upper echelons of the Conservative Party, there really is no plan yet how to handle that. And I think the opinion is still slightly split from those saying, which is, you hear from quite a lot of Scottish stories, just refuse her demand outright. Do not hold a referendum on any account, because it's the British government who have to allow one to happen, as it did in 2014, summer 2014, September 2014. And if the British government refused one, then it is not legally binding. So Nicola Sturgeon can shout as much as she wants and even have a poll, but it won't be legally binding. There are others who say to go against her on that and to simply disallow that would only play into her hands, because she'd like nothing more than arrogant English old Etonian telling Scots what they can and can't have their own say on. So there is a row on that. I think the one thing we can be reasonably sure on is that Boris Johnson won't play much personal part in any of this, because he absolutely stinks in Scotland. He's got a -60 rating up there in terms of popularity, which is quite appalling. So it will be a battle fought by the Scots with the Scots. And I think this British Prime Minister will try his very damnedest to stay out of it, which is of course ironic, because the entire country's identity rests on it. So that's Boris Johnson. Happy to come back to him in questions. Brexit, briefly. I won't bore you too much about this, because I think you're all fully aware of the Brexit arguments. They've been played out quite heavily over the last 4 or 5 years, and certainly the last sort of few months and weeks. We are basically where we are, in that there's 3 big areas of disagreement still are being disagreed over, which is level playing field, state aid, etc., fishing, and governance, how you govern a Brexit treaty. Level playing field and governance are quite close now, I'm told, but fishing is still the real problem. It's such a tiny part of everybody's economy, but so politically enormous. And Emmanuel Macron especially is really struggling with this, because he has some elections coming up next year, not his, but local elections, and the Front National are going to make a huge play if he's seen to screw over French fishermen and prevent them being able to fish as much, or even at all, in the North Sea and in Britain's waters. So he's digging in hard on that. As we speak, the 2 sides, Lord Frost and Michel Barnier's teams, are still in a little basement room in the Department of Bays, the Department of Business on Victoria Street. I'm told by somebody who has been in there quite a bit that it has no windows and no clocks in it whatsoever. So mornings turn into afternoons and nights very easily without anyone really knowing what time of day is at all. Pizzas were taken in late last night. they've been in this tunnel, as it's known, of talks since really Saturday, when both sides have really gone very quiet indeed in the hope they can desperately pull together a deal. It feels to me that it won't be dependent on them, but it will be dependent on their two camps. I think they can get a deal. I think there is a clear landing zone on compromises, which we can talk about if you'd like. But effectively, it means kicking it into the long grass. You can decide on not deciding. You can have review clauses. Well, we'll do this for a bit, and then we'll have a good old shout about it. And it effectively means you don't have to take the crucial big decisions now, be it on fish or on deregulation. But will France, the Netherlands, two passionate countries about fishing, allow it? And will the ERG on the other side, the Tory Eurosceptics, allow Boris Johnson to do that compromise? And that, I think, we'll find out in the next 72 hours. It's going to be a very tense and interesting weekend for sure. Worth pointing out, though, of course, even best case scenario of a trade deal being agreed of the likes Boris Johnson envisages, that isn't going to do amazing things to the economy. The OBR predicted that it would take, even with a deal, would take 4% off growth that we would have had inside the European Union in the short to medium term, and an extra 2% off GDP next year if there is no deal. So it's a downside without a doubt until these new markets can be found, or we deregulate and find new sources for revenue, which I'm not saying isn't impossible, but I think it's going to take a few years to get to. So that's Brexit. Clearly, the stakes are absolutely massive on that. Quickly, finally, my thoughts on the Biden presidency before we go to questions, because that's another giant unknown coming down the conveyor belt into 2021, and another enormous implication. Mark Sedwill, the former cabinet secretary who I interviewed a couple of weeks back, told me that dealing with any US president, he had a wonderful analogy for it, which I think he stolen from a previous US ambassador, but he was using it anyway. He said, dealing with any US president is like waltzing with a brontosaurus, which captured a lovely little image there. But you tread incredibly carefully, obviously, because you don't know where they're going to put their great big clunking paws. And a Biden presidency clearly has a lot of benefits as compared to a Trump presidency, a deeply erratic owner of the White House who sprung surprises left, right, and centre on the British government, who couldn't do much but openly nod politely and try desperately to try and influence that behind the scenes with often little effect. But a Biden presidency is going to be really interesting because in terms of policies, his policy position, he's pretty close to where the UK already is on climate change. That's Big Ben. That's wonderful. I think it might be Mike who's got Big Ben in his house, but maybe that's just a polite reminder. I need to speed on to questions, Mike. We're almost there. We haven't heard Big Ben for a few years, so that was lovely. Biden shares a lot of policies with Boris Johnson, a remarkably large amount, actually, in terms of foreign policy. Climate change, they're very aligned, and obviously Boris Johnson's hosting the COP26 climate change summit in Glasgow this year. He's desperate, next November, and he's desperate for that to be a big success. And when people say Paris and Kyoto, they say Glasgow, which is will certainly change the fate of Glasgow's place in history. But climate change, but also Iran. Joe Biden would take us back into the Iranian nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and also he's very prominently anti-Russia, a lot more than President Trump. So a lot of things to ally over. Does he dislike Boris Johnson? That's been the chat. The two men have never actually met, despite the fact that Joe Biden was vice president for 8 years under Obama. Certainly the Biden camp and the Obama camp had little love for Boris Johnson. They were pretty offended by what he said over Brexit, calling Obama a half Kenyan and that sort of stuff. But I was in Washington for a couple of weeks covering the election, which was an amazing experience. And just quickly, that Saturday morning, it was Saturday afternoon your time, but about 11:30 on Saturday morning, 5 days after the election itself, and all the TV networks suddenly called Pennsylvania for Biden, and therefore the election, because it got him over the line in terms of electoral college votes. It was an incredible feeling being on the streets of DC, which is a very Democrat city. Honking horns spontaneously erupted all over the city. People started cheering, celebrating. It was like witnessing the downfall of a sort of, Ceausescu or some sort of Eastern European dictator. But we then quickly drove upstate into Pennsylvania, into Trump areas. to try and get their reaction. And there was outright fury and total denial about what had happened. So it's a deeply, deeply divided country, and quite extraordinary to observe all that. But I did also speak to a couple of people quite close to Joe Biden. I interviewed a chap called Chris Coons, Senator Chris Coons, who is a senator for Delaware. In fact, he took Joe Biden's Senate seat when Joe Biden was elevated to the vice presidency. And Chris Coons was adamant that Biden's a pragmatist. He's very pro-European, as are all the people around him, pro-EU, a big globalist, but also a big Atlanticist. And he wants to get this stuff done. And if that means being nice and friendly to Boris Johnson, then he'll happily do that. Interesting, not even the US Embassy know precisely which way the Biden administration is going to lean on various issues. I was talking to some of their people yesterday. They're waiting desperately for clues, when Biden wants to come, who wants to visit first in Europe. There's chat he might go to Brussels, not London or Paris or Berlin first. He's coming here, we hope, if the pandemic allows, for the G7 summit in the middle of 2021, which Boris Johnson is also hosting. It's going to be a big international year for Boris Johnson, if he's still there. Again, huge amounts of unknowns. I personally want to know whether he's going to keep the red button on his desk. So I had the great pleasure, it has to be said, of interviewing President Trump last year, 2018, just before he arrived for his state visit, which was the one before the messy one in Chequers when he insulted Theresa May. I also interviewed him just before that. But this was my first time in the Oval Office, which was any journalist's or bucket list immediately ticked, and a huge exciting experience. And he's a very charming person in the flesh. He's polite, like all Americans are, and he sat us down and we got talking, and we had the initial slightly fluffy questions to begin with of how brilliant are you really, Mr. President, and how would you have solved world peace, etc. And once we got him talking, we then gone on to slightly more tricky subjects, like the fact that Meghan Markle had insulted him. He didn't know that. He got quite upset about that. And the more difficult territory we got into, the more he started looking at this red button on his desk. So the Oval Office desk, the Resolute desk, which is his desk built out of an old British warship and gifted to Queen Victoria, to the US president at the time, has on it nothing, because his actual office is a little cubbyhole off the Oval Office where there's sort of a bank of TV screens, and I suspect it is always tweeting. But the Oval itself is just this bare desk, a very large series of telephones, and this little red button. So my colleague Tim Shipman and I from the Sunday Times are staring at this little red button thinking, what does that do? Does that launch a nuclear strike on North Korea? Does it open up this hole underneath us when we go shooting down into the shark pool and get eaten up? And eventually we got to a trickier question, and President Trump just jabbed at it. He pressed the red button, which led to this sort of audible intake of breath from Tim Shipman and I, thinking what would happen next. And almost immediately, a butler emerged from one of the anterooms of the Oval with a tray, a silver tray with a Diet Coke on it, and presented it to the president, who said, thank you very much, and offered us a Diet Coke. So we said, yeah, we'll have Diet Coke, sure. So it turns out the leader of the free world, the most powerful man in the world, has on his desk a red button that is actually the Diet Coke button. It does nothing else more than that. Priorities, maybe. Anyway, we don't know what Joe Biden's going to do with the red button either. I think what we can say, certainly getting back to the brackets, I can try and sort of guide 2021 in, is that Joe Biden will have a moderating influence on Boris Johnson and British policy, domestic and foreign. In that, he is a globalist in the old-fashioned sense of the world. He does believe in the old world order, which we knew really up until, I suppose, 2016, before the election of the populists all over the world and Putin's rise, really. So we could certainly start seeing a return to that. But also, he as a moderator, a moderating influence, he doesn't no longer offer any top cover to Boris Johnson for mold breaking, if you like, doing radical, dramatic things. I think Trump almost authorized, really, because he did so many of them, gave Boris Johnson the wider political space to do them as well, especially when they were popular. I think we'll see less of those now. Someone quite senior in Downing Street said to me a couple of weeks ago, we're living in a Biden world now, which I thought was very telling. They're clearly thinking quite hard about what a Biden world looks like and what it means to them and what it means to what they can do here as well as elsewhere. My final thought before we go on to questions is merely that we have 48 days left of a Trump world. President Trump is indeed still president until the 20th of January, when Biden is inaugurated. We don't even know if Trump's going to go to the inauguration yet, but what we do know is that those 48 days, I don't think will be action-free, and we could still see one or two cheeky surprises yet, which make 2021 and the start of it even more unpredictable. So I think I should probably stop there. That's hopefully a decent sort of run through of where we are, a rapid canter, and open up to questions and the like.
That was a really good ramble, Tom. That was just what we wanted. Such a wide variety of topics covered. And you've had some very nice compliments whilst you've been speaking. He's great, isn't he? I'm not going to tell you who said it, but some really good stuff. So just what we wanted. So some questions, please. I know Karen Clark's got one. Karen, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, certainly. So I was keen to understand, Tom, what you think Keir Starmer's best opportunities are going to be over the next 12 months to establish himself as a credible alternative to the Tories, other than just Boris Johnson and the Tories giving him a helping hand, and whether you think he will actually prove to be a viable leader going forward.
Yeah, I didn't touch on Keir, I'm afraid, because someone else trying to shoehorn in. But it's his trajectory is going to be really interesting. I mean, he's got off to a great start. I mean, that much I think we can say immediately, in that his forensic exacting style has proved a very good foil to Boris Johnson when it comes to dissecting coronavirus policy or during P&Qs. And he trips up the Prime Minister, quite easily. It's Roundhead versus Cavalier, really. Soon, very soon, he's going to have to start making some big decisions over his party. I mean, we saw that with the coronavirus tiering system vote this week. He chose to abstain. And I think you can do that a few times on a few issues. And he's abstained a bit, actually, of late, simply on issues that are too difficult for his own party to come to sort of a joined-up view on. You can't really do that forever. And the killer decision he's going to have to make before the end of this year, if indeed there is a Brexit deal, of course, is whether or not to vote for that. And that's going to be a massive defining moment. And there's a huge row going on in the shadow cabinet at the moment about whether to do that. He wants his party to vote for a deal now because he thinks, as advised by perhaps some of the northern MPs in his shadow cabinet, that that's the only way to re-ingratiate themselves with the red wall, who think still he opposes Brexit. And just worth actually making the point that no matter everything that's happened this year, I forgot to make this bit earlier, Boris Johnson is still popular as Prime Minister in those red wall seats. They don't spend huge amounts of time dissecting all this sort of stuff like I have to. And they look at him and, the polls demonstrate this. The Tories are still neck and neck with Labour. If you think, what's happened in the last year, it's a staggering thing to think that they're neck and neck in terms of popularity. Sure, they've lost 10% in a year, but then again, most incumbent governments do. But Boris Johnson is not at all 10 points behind in the polls and deeply unpopular in these target seats. They quite like him. They like him as a man. And I think being clever, working on what you want to do in Commons votes, and crucially picking the right side on Brexit to re-ingratiate itself with red wall is one thing he can do that is very, very different to coming up in front of the electorate, coming face to face with winning people's votes. And Boris Johnson, we know, is extremely good at that. Whatever you want to throw at Boris Johnson, he's a tremendous communicator. He gets people to like him. Not everybody, and hasn't worked in Scotland, obviously, but he does connect with those red wallers. And that is going to be Keir Starmer's test. He can score points in the Commons, but when it comes to hitting the electoral trail, making himself popular as a person and known as a person, I honestly think he's still got a mountain to climb on that, which he's really just, in the early foothills of. I hope that helps.
Yeah, great. Next question. Peter Blawston, what have you got to say?
Hi. Well, as usual, lots. My question, Tom, is more domestic focused, which is, do you think that this pandemic has shown that local mayors and the devolved governments are now more effective opposition than the parliamentary opposition?
It certainly have in the last, I suppose, 4 or so, 5 weeks. They've been given a platform, if you like, because so much of the coronavirus tiering and local decision-making has been on that sort of council and mayoral level, regional level, that they've been given a very big say. of course, that said, while their profile, I think, has been raised, and probably that's no bad thing at all, their power is still quite limited in a lot of areas. Healthcare, for example, that's not a devolved matter. Well, Scotland and Wales have their own healthcare powers, but council by council, they don't. And I think it's quite possible that once this pandemic has passed, then we see, I suppose, a slight reversal in their profile, and people should simply stop talking about them. The other thing that could happen, of course, is that the Tories could realise that devolution is indeed down to sort of mayoral level, mayoral regional level. The mayor of Yorkshire, the mayors of Manchester, Liverpool, etc. That actually giving them power and making them responsible for their own areas is probably quite a good thing, and quite a good thing for their own politics as well. So you can point the blame at them rather than central government. So it could well be a permanent change, but I think it would need legislation and power, more power shifts from London to those mayoral areas first for that to happen.
Okay. Next question. Peter Borum from Mercer, comments?
Gave me heart failure when you said Peter Blaughton, and I'm just interested in the multi-speedness of the recovery and the impact you think that have on politics. Because if I look at my own clients, I'm an executive award consultant, and therefore I'm involved in discussions about how much money companies are making, what sort of bonuses chief executives are getting. There are some businesses who are doing absolutely fine through all of this. There's some companies who are largely unaffected. There's some with a following wind. There are some who are somewhat affected, but it's a long way from a catastrophe. And then, as you've mentioned already, Tom, sectors like hospitality, obviously devastating impact. And I'm just interested in the sort of multi-speed nature of the recovery. What impact do you think that will have socially and on politics?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. It's a really interesting question. I think the answer is we really don't yet know. It sounds like a dreadful cop-out, but it depends where it shakes down. I mean, we know the areas that are going to really, really struggle, obviously hospitality, but that is a sector where, I mean, the government, one of the reasons the government argue privately against more financial help for the hospitality sector, pubs and the like, is that they say that it's already a sector that has a very high turnover. Staff come and go quite quickly. So it's effectively a sector that's quite resilient, and there will always be a workforce you can employ from somewhere. It's a slightly cruel argument to make, but that's why they don't make it in public. It's also spread entirety across the country. There's no particular regional focus. There aren't any more pubs in red wall areas or the north than there are in the south. So it won't necessarily play out. I think as a general rule, I suppose I'd say what the pandemic has done almost universally is exacerbate existing trends. So whether it's poorer people having worse health outcomes and being more unhealthy, that has been exacerbated by coronavirus. The South and the Southeast has always been pretty resilient economically and has been pretty protected by coronavirus, apart from if you live anywhere near Crawley, which services Gatwick, which has been the single biggest affected town by coronavirus anywhere in the country, because obviously a lot of people work for Gatwick Airport and their jobs have been decimated by that. But manufacturing has been hit harder than services. There are more manufacturing areas in the Midlands and the North. So I suspect the trends that currently exist, which are areas of deprivation, areas that have been left behind, will feel slightly more left behind, and areas that have always done okay will feel they've done okay. So there probably won't be anything brand new that will emerge from this, but it would just exacerbate the problems that we already have. Although I'm sorry, that's a slight cop out, because it's very hard to call this still, because again, we don't know the speed of this and how resilient so many of these different companies are going to be able to be. Are they going to get to March and still be intact, or will most British pubs and hoteliers, etc., have folded by then? It's very, very difficult to see.
If I know the answer, I wouldn't have asked it. So can I just ask a quick follow-up, which is about public versus private sector? So there's been quite an interesting debate. Obviously the announcement that a lot of public sector workers will have their salaries frozen, predictable reactions from people. Nobody wants to hear that about their own job. But of course, in the private sector, wages are going down.
Yes.
Typically somewhere between 5 and 75% of pay is variable. And in most, but not all sectors, that variable number is going to reduce. So people's total earnings over the year will have gone down. Do you have any sense of awareness in government amongst policymakers about what's likely to be happening in the private sector? And is that one of the things that's driven their decision to freeze the salaries of the public sector?
Very much so. And the Chancellor began making that argument last week when he announced the public sector wage freeze, although not for all, only about half the public sector. It was actually a little bit more generous than we were expecting, because the very low paid, or those below the median wage, and obviously the million people employed by the health service are not having their wages frozen. So it could have been more stringent. But yeah, absolutely, that was the argument. I think the figure he used is that private sector wages are down 4% year on year, and public sector wages are up 1%. And clearly there's an anomaly. It does feel a lot like the days of 2010, 2011, when the public sector weren't that badly hit by the financial crisis, and obviously the private sector was, and that was the argument the government used to freeze pay for a while. So yes, that's the argument they're using. The difference this time round is, of course, Boris Johnson has promised no return to austerity. Austerity absolutely is either public sector wage freezes or real terms cuts, which is what a public sector wage freeze is. So it's going to be a difficult political argument to make that you're not returning to austerity if you do that. That said, you've got to make this money back from somewhere. And while the private sector is still in a bit of pain, then it's a good cut to make. But again, the problem is with that, when you look at the handshake recovery and financial services, bankers, if bankers start paying each other big bonuses again, this financial year or next, and I understand a lot of you might be writing those checks, then immediately you'll have an argument, well, wait a minute, the public sector's in a pay freeze and hospitality pay has gone down 20% or whatever it is. And because it is an unfair economic, an unbalanced recovery, it's not like 2010, 2011. We are not all in it together at all. And it undoubtedly will cause a huge amount of tension, across all those different sectors.
Tom, turning to the European Union, what are your thoughts on a sort of a post-Brexit EU? So obviously going to have a new German Chancellor at some point. Macron's making his stakes clear. You've got the challenges in Hungary, Slovakia, Poland from a political point of view, and a new president of the Commission. Where do you see the EU shaping up over the next couple of years?
Again, really interesting. A big area of potential movement, because Britain leaving the EU has given many of the Europhiles around those 27 seats, the 27 heads of state, real incentive to do what Britain was always holding them back to do, and really press on with ever closer union. And at the moment there's a big conference being planned. I forget the precise name, Future of Europe or some grand something like that, which they're currently arguing over who should chair. There's a big push for the former Danish Prime Minister, Stephen Kinnock's wife, to chair it. Others want to stop it. And it's that vision. And there is a competing vision across Europe. The Macrons and potentially Merkel's, or whoever succeeds Merkel, want closer union and really want to press on now, where others don't. Poland and Hungary being very good examples, but also some of the Scandinavian countries, the Dutch may be far more skeptical about that. So I think this is pretty much heading towards the thing that Britain always wanted to stop, and actually so did Macron and Merkel, a 2 or possibly 3-tier Europe. You'll have that there already is. There's the Schengen zone, there's the single currency zone, but it could well end up being formalized, where those who really do want to press on and merge central banking more, merge tax policy more, will do that, and then others won't. And so you'll have these sort of concentric rings. Slightly begs the question, where does Britain end up in those concentric rings? Does all this end up with a ring that actually would involve European Union membership, but actually doesn't look too much like what we might end up with anyway with a Brexit trade deal? So I think it is hugely up for debate. There is no homogenous view of where Europe is going to go, where the EU is going to go. But if you had to pick one, I think we'd end up with a concentric circles. There's just no way you can take Poland and Hungary under current leadership to the same place that Macron wants to go. And that's impossible. So they will probably end up having to agree to disagree.
Yeah. Okay. Next one.
Yeah, Mike, I have a question. It's Catherine.
Sure.
Hi. So thank you, first of all. It's fascinating. I lived in the US for the last 16 years, recently back in London, so very connected to both sides of the pond. It's a little offbeat, my question, but I'm really interested in your insights in what's really happening in the civil service. You know, again, trying to get back up to speed on what's happening here in the UK. I get the sense that a lot of the civil services is struggling with this government, and you hear all kinds of things, and I'm just kind of interested in your take or your insights into how actually government, aside from Boris, is actually working at the moment.
Yeah, well, most of it appears to be remote still, actually, which isn't helping matters at all either. I mean, pretty much every civil servant I come across is still working from home and doing things by Zoom, etc., because that's the government guidelines. You know, don't come in unless you really have to, and it still is in tier 2, which most of the civil servants are still in. I think work from home if you can. Yeah. So it makes it even harder. I mean, managing a pandemic and Brexit at the same time working from home has been incredibly hard work. And I think the truth is, pretty much all of the civil service is really either doing one of those two things at the moment. There is no other, policy making going on. It's absolutely, hell for leather. It's crisis mode without a doubt. And I think it's performed reasonably well in a crisis, really, when you think, what it's had to do, how much it's had to turn around. I mean, there's been some substantial failings and shortfalls, as we know, but it's sort of held together in a very hostile, certainly a lot of hostile noise coming from number 10. No actual hostile actions as yet. There is this fabled cut of the press offices that they're all being culled by 70% allegedly, although I think the brakes can be put on that, or have just been put on that actually a little bit. The departure of Dominic Cummings from number 10 was greeted with widespread relief across the civil service because he had some pretty radical ideas. He's never been a huge friend of the civil servants. There is a little relief that the whole thing's not going to be completely blown up by the Cummings master plan. There does, though, I think there is an acceptance across the board, though, that the civil service could be better.
Right.
You don't have many civil servants saying, we're the best in the world, it's outrageous, we shouldn't be reformed at all. And, with the fast forward, the pandemic is having the effect it's having on the way we all interact and behave, there is a feeling that more can be done, it can be done better, it can be done quicker, and, with a bit more technology. So there's no huge hostility to reform, I don't detect. And I can see a world where the civil service gets on quite comfortably, actually, with number 10, once this all shakes down. Interestingly, the only area, I think I'm right in saying this, one of the OBR tables from last week, the only sector of growth across the entirety of the UK economy throughout the pandemic has been the civil service. They have put on numbers simply because they need to,
right? I was going to say that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, they had a whole load more to do, so fine, hire a few more of them. But Brexit has done that as well, because you're having to hire civil servants to do the job that was previously done in Brussels. So actually, they're not doing badly. Fine, they're under a bit of pay restraint at the moment. But I think, to sum up, the initial tensions that we were talking about when the Johnson government first came in, about them blowing everything up and sacking everybody, they haven't come to pass. And things are actually going to be probably quite a fair bit better than some of those initial sort of doomsday scenarios. If that helps answer your question.
Thank you.
One more.
Tom, you said the last 6 weeks of the US Trump's presidency unlikely to end without incident. I wonder what you think some of those incidents may be.
Tricky. Well, he tried to invade Iran the other day. He was held back from doing that by the Pentagon with some massive relief from everybody. So I think we might just avoid a crisis in the Middle East. I think if I had to pick anywhere, I suppose China would be the most obvious flashpoint. I mean, what he's trying to do is what Gordon Brown did to David Cameron in 2010, just before Gordon Brown left government. He planted a series of massive landmines, knowing he was going to leave government, that David Cameron would have to diffuse, such as 50% tax rate, one or two other bits and bobs, enshrining huge amounts of welfare payments to older people, which was financially unaffordable, purely to try and trip up David Cameron. Trump's going to do the same with Biden. He's made that clear. So writing in quite a lot of pretty hostile activity on China, whether it's sort of asset freezes or travel bans or more sanctions, stuff that Biden will find particularly hard to unlock. Might even provoke some sort of standoff in the South China Seas, or those sort of disputed aroas and islands there. But it would be, I think he'd struggle not to cause some sort of final fistfight with the Chinese. What else can he do? I mean, he's got executive powers to do pretty much anything unchecked. He can't spend very much money without Congress, stopping him from doing that. But the other interesting thing is pardoning. He's going to pardon everyone he can think of, everyone who ever worked for him who's fallen foul of the US justice system. What's going to be fascinating, and this will cause a spectacular constitutional crisis. It may not affect the world too much, but it will have America in pieces for many weeks, is if he decides to pardon himself retrospectively. Now, it's unclear whether he can do that. It's unclear whether a sitting president can pardon himself retrospectively forevermore. But it'd be surprising if he doesn't try, not least because he's got some pretty heavy questions of his own to answer for the next 4 years. And the Democrats, actually some Republicans, would delight in seeing him tied up in congressional inquiries and legal red tape for years to come over his various dealings and activities as president. So if he tries to do that, it has to go to Supreme Court pretty quickly. But you could certainly then see that become quite a cool celeb, and everyone on both sides mobilizing, the pro-Trump fanatics mobilizing. And I think January, mid to late January is going to be a very nervous time in the US. That kind of street violence that was predicted around the election didn't happen, luckily. I mean, downtown Washington, DC was all boarded up. It was extraordinary. It felt like some sort of riot town. But we didn't see that. We saw some angry people, but not, widespread violence. Everybody was terrified that would happen, and gun shops had all sold out of ammunition. Everyone was busily stocking up, to slightly alarmingly. So it's a very brittle situation still. There's still a lot of anger. And Trump supporters, not all of them, of course, but there is a residual, quite large amount of them who are passionate about this, and they don't want to see their guy taken down. And if he provokes a constitutional crisis by trying to pardon himself, something like that, that could get quite ugly. So I think that's what I mean. I don't expect a world war, but he won't go quietly and peacefully. I think he's finally said he's going to go, but there'll be some explosions on the way out first.
And just before we let you go there, Tom, I mean, you have in front of you a group of senior HR people. What should they be watching out for next year? What's the one thing that would concern you if you're a senior manager in an organisation?
In charge of hiring and firing?
Yeah, or just general business issues. What would be on your agenda?
I mean, the speed of our exit from the pandemic is going to dictate everything. I think. I mean, once Brexit, you'll know about by the end of the weekend, I think, or possibly will creep into next week. But I would just watch every step of the vaccines being rolled out, how quickly they're arriving, how quickly the distribution is set up. Because if we're in the clear by Easter, then great. If we're still trying to roll out a vaccine, you've still got 20 people at risk, shielding or being protected, then the restrictions will remain in place. That does desperate damage to the economy as well as the political fabric. So every day now seems to matter. Every truck getting through with the vaccines on, I would watch those closely, because that is going to dictate everything really next year, in terms of the speed of the recovery.
Brilliant. Hey, that was a really good session. We all enjoyed that. Some really nice comments about your delivery. So top class. Thanks very much. It's 1 o'clock. We said we'd finish, and it's Times Radio, is it?
It's still Times Radio. Hasn't changed in the last time, I'm pleased to say. Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll all be tuning in. Thanks ever so much, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.